The cameras caught everything. The trembling of her fingers, the stillness of his gaze, and the exact second a perfect wedding began to fracture under the weight of a truth no one had prepared to hear. The ballroom glowed like something lifted out of a magazine spread, gold chandeliers casting soft light across marble floors polished to a mirror sheen. Every table dressed in ivory, silk, and crystal, every seat filled with eyes waiting for a moment worth remembering. And at the far end of the aisle, beneath an arch of white orchids and glass, Amara Hayes took her first step forward, her heels barely making a sound against the floor, her posture straight, her chin lifted just enough to hold the room without asking for it, while the soft swell of a live string quartet curled through the air, elegant and controlled, masking the quiet storm building beneath the surface of a moment that looked flawless from every angle. And yet beneath the layers of satin wrapped around her body, beneath the careful makeup and the calm in her eyes, there was a truth she carried like a sealed letter pressed against her ribs, a truth that had weight, that had consequence, that had a heartbeat all its own. And she felt it now in the way her breath came slower, deeper, measured as if each inhale had to pass through something heavier than air itself. And at the altar stood Ethan Cole, the man whose name alone could shift markets, the face of coal dynamics, a company that had built entire skylines and rewritten the rules of power in boardrooms across the country. His tuxedo cut with precision, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable in a way that had made investors trust him and competitors fear him. And as the cameras lining the aisle tilted forward to capture her approach, red lights blinking, lenses adjusting, live stream feeds already carrying the moment to screens far beyond the walls of the ballroom, Ethan did not move to meet her, did not soften, did not reach out. He simply watched her the way he might watch a negotiation unfold, calculated, distant, controlled, and for a brief second, just as she came within arm's reach, Amara noticed the smallest shift, not in his face, but in the absence of something that should have been there, a warmth, a connection, a recognition, and it was gone, replaced by something colder, something final, and the music, which had filled the room just moments ago, seemed to fade not because it stopped, but because no one could hear it anymore. Not over the sound of anticipation tightening in the air, not over the silence that pressed in between them like a held breath that refused to release. And then he leaned in, just close enough that his voice wouldn't carry to the guests, but the microphones hidden among the floral arrangements caught every word anyway, amplifying it through unseen channels, recording it for a future neither of them could control. And he said, low, flat, without emotion, "You lied." And the words landed with the weight of something far larger than their size. And Amara did not flinch, her fingers tightening just slightly around the bouquet she held, her voice steady when she answered, "You told me to let it go." And for a fraction of a second, there was a flicker in his eyes, not doubt, not regret, just acknowledgement. And then he straightened, turning away from her as if the moment between them had already ended, as if whatever this was had already been decided long before she walked down that aisle. And when he spoke again, he didn't lower his voice this time. He didn't hide it. He didn't soften it for the sake of dignity or decorum or the hundreds of people watching. He simply said, clear, and sharp enough to cut through the room, "This wedding is over." And the effect was immediate, like glass shattering in slow motion, gasps rising in waves from the guests, chairs shifting, hands flying to mouths, the quartet faltering mid-note before falling into silence entirely. And the cameras, God, the cameras, didn't stop. They never stopped. Flashes bursting like tiny explosions of light, phones lifting higher, capturing, zooming, feeding the moment into a network of eyes that would replay it again and again before the night was over. And at the center of it all stood Amara, alone now at the altar, her dress cascading around her like something too heavy for the moment it was meant to hold, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but her body still, perfectly still, as if movement would confirm the narrative forming in the minds of everyone watching. The abandoned bride, the spectacle, the woman left behind. But she did not collapse, did not chase him, did not call his name. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her breathing controlled, her silence louder than the chaos building around her. And Ethan had already turned, already begun walking toward the exit, his steps measured, unhurried. as though leaving her in front of the world required no more effort than closing a deal. And the doors at the far end of the ballroom began to open, light from outside spilling in, cutting across the polished floor in sharp lines. And for a moment it seemed like that would be the image that defined everything. The powerful man walking away, the woman left behind, the story already writing itself in headlines and captions. But then a voice rose from the third row, clear, steady, impossible to ignore. "You're ending it over a child?" And the room shifted again, attention snapping toward the source, toward the man who had just stood, his presence commanding in a way that didn't rely on noise or force, but on certainty. And he stepped into the aisle without hesitation, moving forward with a calm that contrasted the chaos around him, his suit dark, his posture relaxed but deliberate, his eyes fixed not on Ethan, but on Amara, as if the entire room had narrowed to the space between them. And the murmurs that had begun to rise fell again into a tense, fragile quiet as he reached the front, stopping just short of the altar where everything had unraveled. And Ethan paused near the doors, not turning fully, but enough to acknowledge that something had interrupted the narrative he thought he controlled. And the stranger didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, because the room was already listening, every camera now trained on him, every breath held. And he spoke with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Then you should know," he said, his gaze never leaving Amara's face. "That child is mine." And the words didn't explode so much as they dropped, heavy and precise, sinking into the space between everyone present, reshaping the moment in real time, rewriting the story before it could settle. And for the first time since the ceremony began, Ethan Cole turned fully back around, the control that had defined him slipping just enough to reveal something unfamiliar beneath it. Not panic, not yet, but the unmistakable fracture of certainty, while Amara remained exactly where she was, her expression unreadable, her silence intact, holding the center of a moment that no longer belonged to the man who tried to end it, but to the truth that had just stepped forward and claimed its place in the light. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was waiting for someone to decide which version of reality would survive the next breath. And for a long second no one moved, not the guests frozen in their seats, not the staff lingering at the edges of the ballroom, not even the cameras that continued to blink and hum as though they were the only things still functioning in a world that had just tilted off its axis. And at the center of it all stood Amara Hayes, her hands still, her shoulders steady, her gaze locked forward not in defiance, but in control, the kind of control that came from knowing something no one else in that room had fully understood yet. While just a few feet away, Ethan Cole's composure began to fracture in ways so subtle most would have missed it. A tightening in his jaw, a pause in his breathing, the slight shift of his stance as he recalibrated a situation that had slipped beyond the parameters he had set, and across. From them Julian Cross did not step back, did not soften his presence. He stood as if the spotlight had always been his, as if he had been waiting not for permission, but for the exact second when truth would have the most impact. And when Ethan finally spoke again, his voice was not raised but sharpened, edged with something colder than before. "You need to leave," he said, not as a request, but as a directive, the kind that had moved executives out of rooms and silenced opposition without question. But Julian did not move, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged. And when he answered, it was with a calm that did not challenge Ethan's authority, but simply refused to recognize it. "I am not the one who should be leaving," he said, and the weight of that response rippled through the room, drawing a fresh wave of murmurs from the guests, voices low and urgent, speculation already beginning to form into narratives that would spread far beyond those walls within minutes. And somewhere near the front row, a phone tilted slightly higher, capturing every angle, every expression, every hesitation, feeding it live to an audience that could not hear the subtle shifts in tone, but could feel the tension tightening like a wire pulled too far. And Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to Amara, searching, calculating, as if trying to find confirmation or denial in the stillness of her face. But she gave him neither, her silence holding, her expression unchanged. And that absence of reaction unsettled him more than any accusation could have, because it removed his ability to control the narrative, to shape the moment into something manageable, something strategic, and instead left him exposed to the one thing he had built his entire life avoiding: uncertainty. And for the first time since he had spoken those words that ended everything, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for the cameras to capture it, long enough for the balance of power to begin its slow, irreversible shift. And Julian took one step closer to the altar, not aggressive, not rushed, but deliberate, placing himself fully within the frame of every lens pointed in their direction. And he spoke again, this time not to Ethan but to the room itself, his voice steady, measured, carrying without strain. "You think this is about a lie," he said, and a quiet fell over the crowd once more. "But it is about a decision that was made long before today." And Ethan's expression hardened, the controlled mask snapping back into place as he stepped forward to close the distance between them, his presence imposing, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear clearly, though the microphones would carry it far beyond. "You do not get to rewrite this moment," he said, each word precise. "You do not get to walk in here and make claims without proof." And Julian's gaze did not waver. "Proof is not always what you think it is," he replied, and the exchange hung in the air like a challenge neither man was willing to step away from. But it was Amara who shifted the moment without saying a single word, her hand lowering slowly from the bouquet she had held so tightly, her fingers relaxing as if releasing something invisible, and she took one step forward, not toward either man, but into the space between them, drawing every eye back to her, reclaiming the center of a story that had been pulled in too many directions at once. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who had chosen silence until it mattered most. "Enough," she said, and it was not loud, but it cut through the tension with absolute clarity, and both men turned to her, the room following, the cameras adjusting, the focus narrowing once again to the woman who had not run, had not broken, had not surrendered her place even when everything around her suggested she should. And she did not look at Julian first. She looked at Ethan, holding his gaze with a steadiness that stripped away the distance he had tried to maintain. "You ended this because you believed you knew the truth," she said, her tone even. "But you never asked for it." And there was no accusation in her voice, only fact. And that made it harder to dismiss, harder to deflect, and Ethan's lips parted slightly as if to respond. But no words came immediately, because for the first time he was not speaking from certainty. He was reacting to something he did not fully understand. And Amara turned then, her attention shifting to Julian, her expression unchanged. "And you," she said, not harsh, not welcoming, simply acknowledging his presence, "do not get to claim something that is not yours to define." And the statement did not deny him, did not confirm him. It placed a boundary that neither man could easily cross. And Julian inclined his head slightly, not in submission but in recognition, as if he understood the line she had drawn and respected it, even as the tension between them remained, and the room, which had been holding its breath through every exchange, began to stir again, whispers rising, questions forming, the energy shifting from shock to speculation. And near the back a reporter was already speaking quietly into a headset, feeding details to a producer who would package this moment into something the world could consume within the hour. But inside the ballroom the truth was still unfolding, still unresolved, still waiting for the piece that would anchor it. And Ethan took a step back, not retreating but recalibrating, his mind moving through possibilities, through timelines, through every detail he had dismissed or overlooked. And for the first time since the ceremony began, he looked not at the situation but at Amara herself, really looked, searching her face for something he had missed, something he had chosen not to see. And what he found was not guilt, not fear, but a quiet strength that did not ask for belief, did not demand validation. It simply existed, undeniable in its presence, and that realization unsettled him in a way no public spectacle ever could, because it suggested that the narrative he had built was incomplete, that the control he believed he held was never absolute, and that the truth, whatever it was, had been standing in front of him all along, waiting for the moment he would no longer be able to ignore it. The room did not return to normal because there was no version of normal left to return to, only fragments of expectation hanging in the air like dust caught in the light. And as the murmurs grew louder, folding into layers of speculation and quiet judgment, the cameras leaned in closer, as if they could extract the truth by proximity alone. Every lens now locked on the three figures standing at the front, waiting for the moment when silence would finally give way to something definitive. But Amara did not rush to fill it. She stood grounded in the center of the storm she had not created, yet somehow carried with a calm that felt intentional, as if she had already walked through the consequences long before anyone else realized there would be any. And Ethan felt that shift even if he could not name it. The realization that whatever control he thought he had asserted minutes ago had dissolved into something far more unpredictable, and he straightened slightly, drawing in a measured breath, recalibrating not just the situation but the image of himself within it, because he understood better than anyone that perception was power. And right now that power was slipping, not in a dramatic collapse, but in subtle fractures that multiplied with every unanswered question. And when he spoke again, his voice carried more restraint than before, less edge, more calculation. "Then explain it," he said, directing the words at Amara but letting them hang wide enough for the room to claim them as its own demand. And the effect was immediate, the murmurs quieting again, the attention narrowing, the entire space leaning toward her as if the next sentence would determine which version of the story survived beyond these walls. And Amara did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the weight of their expectation. She kept her gaze steady on Ethan, as if this moment belonged to the two of them regardless of how many people were watching. And when she answered, her voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It simply held. "You are not asking for the truth," she said. "You are asking for confirmation of what you already decided." And the words landed with a precision that cut deeper than accusation, because they exposed something structural, something foundational in the way Ethan had approached everything, not just this moment, but every decision that led to it. And his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition, because there was a part of him that knew she was not entirely wrong, and that realization unsettled him more than any denial could have. And before he could respond, Julian spoke again, not interrupting but stepping into the space the silence had created. "He is not the only one who made a decision," he said, his tone steady, his eyes briefly shifting to Amara before returning to Ethan. And there was something in that glance, something layered, not ownership, not even certainty, but history, a thread that connected them in a way the room could sense but not yet understand. And Ethan caught it, the subtle exchange, the implication beneath it, and it sharpened his focus instantly, redirecting his attention fully to Julian. "What decision are you talking about?" he asked. And the question was direct now, stripped of the earlier dismissal, because the situation no longer allowed him the luxury of ignoring variables. And Julian did not hesitate. "The one where you walked away before you ever asked why." She stayed silent, he said, and the words shifted the energy again, drawing a line not between truth and lie, but between presence and absence, between what had been confronted and what had been avoided. And for a brief moment Ethan said nothing, because the timeline in his mind did not align with the one being suggested, and that discrepancy forced him to reconsider details he had dismissed, conversations he had cut short, signals he had chosen not to follow because they complicated the narrative he preferred. And the cameras captured that pause, that internal recalibration, amplifying it beyond the room into something the outside world would interpret as doubt, as hesitation, as the first visible crack in a man known for certainty. And Amara saw it, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with a quiet acknowledgement that something had finally shifted into a space where truth could exist without being immediately dismissed. And she turned slightly, angling her body so that both men were within her line of sight, reclaiming the center not as a point of conflict, but as a point of clarity. "This is not about who claims what," she said, her voice steady. "And it is not about who believes what they see." And the room leaned in again, drawn by the absence of drama in her tone, by the way she stripped the moment down to something more fundamental. "It is about timing," she continued, "and what happens when people choose not to wait for it." And the statement did not resolve anything on the surface. It did not answer the question that had ignited the entire scene, but it reframed it, shifting the focus from ownership to sequence, from accusation to understanding. And that subtle shift altered the tension in the room. replacing the sharp edges of confrontation with something heavier, more complex, and Ethan felt it, the ground beneath the situation moving in a way he could not control, forcing him into a position he had spent years avoiding, one where he had to listen instead of declare, and that realization slowed him, not physically but mentally, creating space where reaction had once been immediate, and he looked at Amara again, not searching this time, but observing, trying to read what he had missed before, and what he saw was not a woman caught in a lie, not someone scrambling to defend herself, but someone who had been carrying a sequence of events that had not yet been allowed to unfold properly, and that understanding, incomplete as it was, shifted something in him, not enough to resolve the conflict, but enough to disrupt the certainty he had relied on, and Julian, watching the exchange, did not push further, did not press his claim. Again, he simply remained present, a constant within the frame, his earlier statement still echoing in the minds of everyone watching, reshaping the narrative even without repetition, and around them the room continued to hum with restrained energy, the guests no longer just spectators, but participants in a moment that was evolving beyond simple categories. And near the edge of the ballroom, a coordinator whispered urgently into a headset, discussing whether to cut the live stream or let it continue, weighing the risk of exposure against the value of a story that had already begun to spread. But the decision, like everything else in that moment, felt secondary to the reality unfolding at the front, where three people stood at the intersection of perception and truth, each holding a piece of something that had not yet been fully revealed. And as the light from the open doors at the far end of the room stretched further across the floor, cutting a brighter path through the polished marble, it illuminated the space between them in a way that felt almost symbolic, not dramatic, not forced, just present, as if the environment itself was acknowledging the shift, and in that light Amara stood. Without retreat, without urgency, holding her ground not against either man but within the moment itself, allowing the truth to move at its own pace, knowing that when it finally surfaced, it would not need to be defended, only seen. The light continued to stretch across the marble floor, cutting a quiet path between them, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of Amara's breath, steady, controlled, unhurried, while around her the room struggled to keep pace with a reality that refused to resolve into something simple, and Ethan could feel it now in a way he had not allowed himself to feel before. Not the pressure of the crowd or the presence of the cameras, but the weight of something. Internal shifting. Something that had nothing to do with strategy or image and everything to do with the possibility that he had ended something without ever understanding what it was. And that realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in the echo of her words, in the absence of certainty, in the silence she maintained even now, and it unsettled him enough that when he spoke again, the edge in his voice had softened, replaced by something more measured, more searching. Then, "Give me the timing," he said, and this time it was not a demand. It was a question shaped like one, and the distinction mattered, because it shifted the dynamic from control to inquiry, from declaration to listening, and Amara saw it, not as a victory, not as a change she needed to acknowledge, but as a necessary step in a sequence she had already accepted would unfold in its own time, and she did not rush to answer. She let the silence breathe, let the room settle into the space created by his words. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had defined her from the moment she stepped into the light. "The timing began the day you decided silence meant absence," she said, and the statement did not clarify, not yet, but it opened a door, a direction, and Ethan's brow tightened slightly as he processed it, because it pointed to something specific, something he could trace, something that existed within a timeline he had lived through but not fully examined, and before he could respond, Julian shifted his weight, not stepping forward but grounding himself more firmly, as if preparing for the moment when clarity would no longer be optional, and his voice entered the space again, steady and deliberate. 3 months ago," he said, and the number alone sent a ripple through the room, a marker, a point in time that could be measured, understood, questioned, and Ethan's eyes moved to him instantly, sharp now, focused. "Be careful," he said quietly, not threatening but warning, as if the precision of that timeline carried consequences neither of them had yet fully considered, But Julian did not retreat from it. 3 months ago, he repeated, you made a decision based on what you thought you saw, not on what was actually there. And the words landed with a different kind of weight, not explosive, not dramatic, but grounded, rooted in something that felt verifiable, and Ethan's mind moved quickly, retracing, reconstructing, pulling together fragments of memory that had once seemed insignificant but now demanded attention. And the ballroom faded slightly at the edges of his awareness as he searched through that moment, that period, that space in time where something had shifted without his full understanding. And he remembered the conversation, brief, controlled, the way he had interpreted her silence as confirmation of something he had already suspected, the way he had chosen not to press further. Because the conclusion felt cleaner, more manageable, and the realization settled into him slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a growing discomfort that expanded with each passing second. And Amara watched him, not with accusation, not with expectation, but with the quiet patience of someone who knew that understanding could not be forced, only allowed. And she spoke again, not to fill the silence but to guide it. You asked one question, she said, her voice even, and when the answer did not come fast enough, you replaced it with your own. And the simplicity of that statement stripped away layers of assumption, reducing the conflict to something almost stark in its clarity. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, because there was truth in it. Not complete truth, not yet, but enough to shift the foundation he had been standing on. And the cameras captured that moment, the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, the way his gaze no longer carried the same fixed certainty. And across the room the whispers intensified, speculation now evolving into theories, into narratives that would be told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. But at the center of it all, the reality remained anchored in the exchange unfolding at the front. And Julian remained still, his presence no longer disruptive but integrated into the moment, as if he had always been part of this sequence even if no one had recognized it until now. And Ethan turned to him again, not with dismissal but with a question that carried more weight than any he had asked so far. And you, he said, where do you fit into that timing? And the room quieted once more, because this was the piece that had yet to align, the variable that had been introduced without explanation. And Julian met his gaze without hesitation. I was there when she chose not to answer you, he said, and the statement did not clarify everything, but it shifted the context, introducing proximity, involvement, a connection that extended beyond a single claim. And Ethan's expression hardened slightly, not in anger but in focus, because that answer raised as many questions as it addressed. And Amara stepped forward again, not to interrupt, but to anchor the moment before it could spiral into assumptions. He was there, she said, confirming the fact without elaboration, but not in the way you think. And the distinction mattered, because it prevented the narrative from collapsing into something simplistic, something that could be easily judged and dismissed. And Ethan held her gaze, searching for the meaning behind her words, the nuance she was holding back. And for the first time since the ceremony began, his voice carried something unfamiliar, something closer to vulnerability than authority. Then tell me what I am not seeing, he said, and the room seemed to lean in again, not out of curiosity alone but out of recognition that the moment had shifted from confrontation to revelation, that whatever came next would not just reshape the story but redefine the people within it. And Amara inhaled slowly, her hand resting briefly against the fabric of her dress, as if grounding herself in the present before stepping fully into the truth she had carried. And when she spoke, her voice did not change, it remained steady, controlled, but there was a depth to it now, a weight that signaled the beginning of something that could no longer be contained. You are not seeing the difference between a moment and a decision, she said, and the words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that made it clear the next step would change everything. The words settled into the air with a quiet finality, not sharp, not explosive, but undeniable in the way they reframed everything that had come before. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of what had just been introduced demanded space to be understood. and Ethan felt it immediately. The distinction she had drawn between a moment and a decision unfolding in his mind with uncomfortable clarity, because he could see it now, the exact point. Where he had taken something incomplete and forced it into a conclusion. Where he had treated uncertainty as evidence. Where he had chosen speed over understanding. And the realization did not come with relief. It came with a tightening in his chest, a quiet pressure that built with every second he replayed that memory, and the cameras caught the subtle shift in his expression. The way his focus no longer darted between possibilities but turned inward, recalculating, reassessing, and the room, sensing the change, grew quieter again, the earlier whispers fading into a more attentive stillness, as if the audience itself had begun to understand that this was no longer just a spectacle. It was something unfolding with consequence, and Amara did not rush to fill the silence. She let it expand, let Ethan sit in that realization without interruption, because she understood that truth delivered too quickly could be dismissed just as easily. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same steady cadence. But there was a depth to it now, something grounded in the sequence she had lived through. 3 months ago was not the beginning, she said, and the statement shifted the timeline once more, extending it beyond the point Ethan had been fixated on, forcing him to look further back, to consider that what he thought was the origin of the conflict was only a moment within a much larger sequence, and his gaze lifted to hers, sharper now, more intent, because he needed to understand where that sequence truly began, and Julian remained still beside them, his presence no longer intrusive but anchored, as if he was part of the timeline being revealed rather than an interruption to it. And Amara continued. It started before you asked the question, she said, before you decided what the silence meant. And Ethan's mind moved again, reaching back, beyond that conversation, beyond that day, searching for something he might have overlooked, something he had dismissed because it did not fit the narrative he had already begun to construct. And the room leaned in once more, the tension no longer sharp but dense, layered with the awareness that each piece being revealed was not replacing the previous one, but adding to it, building a structure that could not be simplified. And when Amara spoke again, her words came with a clarity that did not seek to persuade, only to state. I knew then that timing would matter, she said, and I chose to wait for it. And the statement shifted something fundamental, because it introduced intention where there had once been assumption, and Ethan's expression tightened slightly as he processed it. Because waiting implied knowledge, it implied that she had been aware of something he had not, something she had chosen not to reveal immediately. And that choice, that control, disrupted the imbalance he had believed existed between them. And he took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but drawn by the need to close the distance created by misunderstanding. Wait for what? He asked. And this time there was no edge in his voice, only a quiet urgency. The kind that came from realizing too late that a moment had been misread, and Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her answer steady. For the truth to stand on its own, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than a detailed explanation ever could, because it suggested that anything forced too early would have been questioned, doubted, dismissed, and that waiting had been her way of protecting it from exactly what had just happened. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath heavier now, because he could see the logic in it even as it unsettled him, even as it forced him to confront the possibility that his actions had accelerated something that should have unfolded differently. And Julian shifted slightly then, not to interrupt, but to support the structure of what was being revealed. She did not wait because she had nothing to say, he added, his tone calm. She waited because she understood how it would be heard, and the words aligned with Amara's in a way that reinforced the narrative without overtaking it. And Ethan's eyes moved between them, not suspicious now, but searching, because their perspectives were not conflicting, they were connected, and that connection carried implications he had not yet fully grasped. And the room, sensing the coherence of their statements, grew even quieter, the earlier tension giving way to a more focused attention, as if the audience itself had shifted from judgment to understanding. And near the back, a guest lowered their phone slightly, no longer chasing a dramatic moment, but trying to capture something more subtle, something more meaningful. And Amara took another step forward, not to dominate the space but to anchor it, her presence steady, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke again her voice carried a quiet finality. "You ended this because you believed the moment was enough," she said. "But you never asked what came before it or what came after." And the words landed with a precision that left little room for deflection, because they did not accuse him of wrongdoing. They exposed the limitation of his perspective, and Ethan felt it fully now, the weight of that limitation, the realization that his decision had been built on a fragment rather than the whole. And for the first time since the ceremony began, his response did not come immediately, because he was no longer reacting, he was considering. And that pause, that shift from certainty to reflection, altered the dynamic in a way that could not be reversed, and the cameras captured it all. The subtle changes, the quiet recalibrations, the moment when a man known for control allowed himself to stand in uncertainty. And in that space Amara remained steady, not pushing, not retreating, simply holding the truth she had carried until it could be seen without distortion. And as the light continued to stretch across the floor, illuminating the space between them, it felt less like a dividing line and more like a path, something that had been there all along, waiting for the moment when it could finally be followed to its end. The path she described did not exist for anyone else in that room, but Ethan could feel it now, not as something visible beneath his feet, but as a sequence unfolding in his mind, each step leading backward through choices he had made too quickly and forward into consequences he had not yet faced. And the realization settled deeper with every passing second, pressing against the certainty he had relied on, reshaping it into something more fragile, more honest. And for the first time since he had walked away from the altar, he did not look at the crowd. He did not glance at the cameras or the open doors or the shifting light across the floor. He looked only at Amara, as if the rest of the room had fallen away, as if the only thing that mattered now was understanding the truth she had carried without forcing it into the wrong moment. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight it had not held before, quieter, stripped of performance. "What came before?" he said, and it was not a full question, not yet, but it opened the space for one, and Amara saw the shift in him, not dramatic, not complete, but real enough to allow the next part of the truth to move forward. And she inhaled slowly, grounding herself not in the room but in the memory she was about to unfold, because what came before was not just information, it was context, it was the reason timing had mattered. And she began without looking away from him, her voice steady. "It started with a doctor's office," she said, and the simplicity of the image contrasted sharply with the grandeur of the ballroom, pulling the moment out of the spotlight and into something quieter, more personal. And Ethan's brow tightened slightly as he processed the shift, because it placed the origin of everything in a space he had never entered, a moment he had never witnessed, and the distance between what he knew and what had actually happened widened instantly. And she continued, "I went alone," she said, and the words carried no accusation, only fact, but they landed with a subtle weight, because they highlighted an absence, a gap in presence that could not be ignored, and Ethan felt it. The implications settling into him, the awareness that there had been moments he was not part of, not because he had been excluded, but because he had not asked to be included, and Julian remained still beside them. His role not to lead this part of the story, but to stand as a quiet confirmation that what she was saying existed beyond her words alone. And the room, sensing the shift away from spectacle into something more intimate, grew quieter in a different way. The earlier tension replaced by a focused stillness, as if everyone understood that this was the part where the truth would take shape. And Amara continued, her tone unchanged. "I did not know everything yet," she said, "but I knew enough to understand that rushing it would make it sound like something it was not." And the statement connected back to her earlier words, reinforcing the idea that timing had not been avoidance but protection, and Ethan's gaze did not leave her face, his focus narrowing as he tried to align this new information with what he had believed, and the gap between the two became impossible to ignore. And she took a small step forward, not closing the distance between them, but grounding herself more firmly in the present as she bridged it with the past. "I tried to tell you," she said. And this time there was a subtle shift in her voice, not emotion in the sense of loss or anger, but a quiet acknowledgement of a moment that had not unfolded the way it should have. "But you were already looking for an answer before I could finish the sentence." and the words landed with a clarity that left little room for interpretation, because they did not accuse him of not caring. They pointed to something more specific, a moment where he had chosen conclusion over conversation, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath heavier now, because he could see it, the memory aligning with her words, the way he had asked, the way he had expected an immediate response, the way he had interpreted her pause as confirmation instead of space. And the realization pressed deeper, not as guilt alone, but as understanding. And he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "And the child," he said, the word carrying more weight now than it had when it first entered the room, because it was no longer a claim or an accusation. It was a piece of a larger truth he had yet to fully grasp, and Amara held his gaze, her answer steady. "The child is not a moment," she said. "It is a timeline." And the statement shifted everything once more, expanding the concept beyond a single event into something ongoing, something that could not be reduced to a single question or answer. And Julian's presence beside them took on a different meaning in that context, not as a challenger, but as part of that timeline. Part of the sequence that had unfolded outside of Ethan's awareness. And Ethan's eyes moved briefly to him, not with suspicion, but with a need to understand where he fit within that expanding frame. And Julian met his gaze without hesitation, his voice calm when he spoke. "I was there when she chose to wait," he said, "and I respected that choice." And the statement did not claim ownership, did not assert dominance. It simply positioned him within the sequence as someone who had witnessed it, without trying to control it. And that distinction mattered, because it contrasted with Ethan's earlier approach without directly opposing it. And the room absorbed that difference, the subtle shift in how the two men were positioned within the same timeline, and Ethan felt it as well. The realization that while he had been searching for answers in the present, others had been allowing the truth to develop in its own time. And that contrast unsettled him in a way that forced him to reconsider not just what had happened, but how he had approached it. And Amara stepped forward again, her presence steady, her voice carrying the quiet finality of someone who had reached the point where holding back no longer served a purpose. "You ended this because you believed you were reacting to the truth," she said. "But you were reacting to an incomplete moment." And the distinction landed with precision, reinforcing the foundation she had been building with each statement. And Ethan stood there, the weight of it settling fully now. The understanding that his decision had not just been premature, but misaligned with the reality it was meant to address. And for the first time since the ceremony began, he did not immediately respond, because there was nothing left to assert, only something to absorb. And in that space the light across the floor seemed brighter, not because it had changed, but because the perspective within it had shifted, illuminating not just the distance between them, but the path that had led there, a path that could no longer be ignored now that it had finally been seen. The realization did not arrive as a single moment, but as a series of quiet shifts, each one settling deeper into Ethan's understanding until the version of events he had relied on no longer held its shape. And the weight of that change anchored him in place, not physically but internally, as if every instinct to respond, to redirect, to regain control had been replaced by something unfamiliar, something slower and far more demanding, the need to truly listen. And in that stillness the room seemed to narrow once more, the edges of the ballroom fading into a soft blur of light and shadow while the space between him and Amara remained sharp, defined, unavoidable. And he could see it now in a way he had not allowed himself to see before. The difference between her silence and absence, the difference between waiting and withholding. And that distinction altered everything, because it meant that what he had interpreted as distance had in fact been presence in a form he had not recognized. And that realization carried a quiet gravity that pressed against his chest, steady and inescapable. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the authority that had once defined it. "Why did you not tell me after?" he asked, and the question lingered in the air, not sharp, not defensive, but searching, shaped by the awareness that there had been time after that moment, time he had not considered. And Amara did not look away, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, because this question was not unexpected. It was part of the sequence she had known would come. And when she answered, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had guided everything she had said so far. Because you did not leave room for after, she said, and the simplicity of it landed with quiet force, because it reframed his departure not just as a reaction but as a conclusion, a final decision that had closed the space where conversation could have continued, and Ethan felt that truth settle into him. The memory aligning with her words, the way he had turned away, the way he had stepped out without looking back, without asking again, without allowing for the possibility that there was more to understand. And the realization did not bring immediate clarity, it brought a deeper awareness of the gap between what he had done and what might have been possible if he had paused, even briefly, and the cameras captured that shift, the subtle lowering of his gaze, the way his shoulders adjusted as if the weight he carried had changed shape, and across from him Julian remained still, his presence steady, not pressing, not retreating, simply existing within the moment as a constant, and Ethan's eyes moved to him again, not with the earlier tension, but with a more focused intent. Because the question of where Julian fit within this unfolding timeline had not disappeared, it had only deepened, and he spoke, this time directing the question fully. And you, he said, when did you become part of this? And the room leaned in once more, because this was the piece that had remained unresolved, the connection that had been implied but not fully explained, and Julian did not hesitate, his answer coming with the same measured tone that had defined his presence from the beginning. Before the question you asked her, he said, and the response was precise, placing him within the timeline not as a reaction but as an existing presence, and Ethan's expression tightened slightly as he processed it, because that placement shifted the narrative again, extending the sequence further back than he had anticipated, and Amara stepped forward just enough to anchor the moment before assumptions could take hold, her voice steady as she added, "He was there when I needed clarity," she said, and the statement did not carry emotion in the way the room might have expected. It carried fact, grounded and intentional, and Ethan held her gaze, searching for meaning beyond the surface of her words, and what he found was not a defense, not an explanation meant to persuade, but a continuation of the same pattern she had followed from the beginning, revealing only what was necessary for the truth to stand without distortion, and that realization shifted something else within him, because it required him to let go of the instinct to fill in the gaps with his own assumptions, to allow the sequence to unfold at the pace she set, and that was not a position he was accustomed to, but it was one he could no longer avoid. And Julian spoke again, not to interrupt, but to add context where it was needed. "I did not step into this to replace anything," he said, his voice calm. "I stepped in because she deserved time to understand what she was facing without being forced into a conclusion." And the words aligned with everything Amara had said, reinforcing the idea that his role had not been one of intrusion but of presence, and the room absorbed that distinction, the subtle difference between someone who claimed and someone who supported, and Ethan felt it as well, the contrast between his earlier reaction and the patience described in Julian's words, and it did not sit easily with him, not because it was wrong but because it highlighted something he had not been, something he had not chosen to be in that moment. And Amara took another small step forward, her presence unwavering, her voice carrying a quiet finality that signaled the next shift in the truth she was revealing. "The child you reacted to," she said, "is not something that belongs to a single moment or a single claim." And the statement expanded the context once more, moving beyond the immediate tension into something broader, something that could not be reduced to a simple answer. And Ethan's focus sharpened, because this was the center of everything, the piece that had triggered his decision, the element that still remained undefined. And he asked, his voice steady but quieter now, "Then what is it?" And the question hung in the air, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this point. And Amara inhaled slowly, grounding herself once more before stepping fully into the truth she had held back until it could no longer be misunderstood. And when she spoke, her voice did not change. It remained calm, controlled, but there was a depth to it now that signaled the line between uncertainty and clarity was about to be crossed. "It is a responsibility," she said, "one that was never meant to be decided in a single question or a single answer." And the words settled into the space between them, not as a resolution, but as a foundation, something solid enough to hold the next part of the truth without collapsing into assumption. And the room seemed to hold its breath once more, not out of shock this time, but out of recognition that the moment had shifted again, that what was coming next would not just clarify the past, but redefine the present. And in that stillness, Amara stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, steady, composed, unshaken by the weight of the moment. Because she had never been standing in reaction, she had been standing in truth, waiting for the right time for it to be seen. The word responsibility did not echo loudly through the ballroom, but it settled deeper than anything that had been said before, anchoring itself in the space between them with a weight that could not be dismissed or redirected. And for a moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their silent lenses capturing a stillness that felt different from the earlier tension, less about shock and more about recognition, because the narrative that had once seemed sharp and simple was now unfolding into something layered, something that required more than quick judgment to understand, and Ethan stood there absorbing it, the concept shifting his perspective in a way that forced him to step outside the narrow frame he had created for himself. And he could feel it, the slow dismantling of certainty. The way each piece of information Amara had offered did not contradict what he believed so much as expand it beyond what he had allowed himself to see. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that shift, quieter, more deliberate. Responsibility to what? He asked. And the question did not challenge her. It sought alignment, as if he was trying to understand not just the meaning of her words, but the reality behind them. And Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, because this was the point where explanation could no longer remain abstract, where the truth had to begin taking a form that could be seen and understood. And she answered with the same calm clarity that had guided every word she had spoken. To what is real, she said, and the simplicity of it might have sounded vague in another moment. But here, in the quiet intensity of the ballroom, it carried a precision that directed everything forward, and Ethan's brow tightened slightly as he processed it, because real meant verifiable, measurable, something that existed beyond assumption. And that implication drew his attention not just to her words, but to the timeline she had been revealing. And he took a small step forward, closing a fraction of the distance between them, not out of control, but out of focus, because he needed to understand where this reality began and how it connected to the decision he had made. And before he could ask again, Amara continued, her voice steady. I did not know everything in the beginning, she said, but I knew enough to not turn it into something it was not. And the statement reinforced the pattern she had followed, the deliberate choice to wait, to allow clarity to form before speaking it into a space that would demand immediate interpretation. And Julian shifted slightly beside them, his presence remaining calm, his role unchanged. And when he spoke, it was not to take control of the moment, but to support its structure. She needed confirmation, he said, not reaction. And the distinction landed with quiet force, because it highlighted the difference between seeking truth and imposing it, and Ethan felt it settle into him. The realization that his response had come before confirmation, that he had reacted to possibility as if it were fact, and the weight of that understanding pressed further, not in a way that broke him, but in a way that grounded him, forcing him to stand within the consequences of his own perception. And the room remained still, the earlier whispers replaced by a focused silence that followed every exchange, as if each person present understood that the truth was no longer a question of who was right or wrong, but of what had actually happened. And Amara took another step forward, her presence unwavering, her voice carrying a quiet finality that signaled the next shift in the truth she was revealing. The responsibility is to not name something before it has been confirmed, she said, and the words drew a clear line between assumption and reality, between the moment Ethan had reacted and the process she had chosen to follow. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, because he could see it now, the exact point where their paths had diverged, where his need for immediate clarity had overridden the need for accurate understanding. And that realization settled into him with a quiet permanence. And he looked at her again, not searching this time, but listening. And he asked, his voice steady, and now, and the question did not need to be completed, because it carried everything that had led to this moment. And Amara understood it fully, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and for a brief second the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of anticipation of drama, but out of recognition that this was the point where everything would align. And she spoke, her voice calm, grounded, certain. "Now it is confirmed," she said, and the words did not rise, they did not echo, but they carried a finality that settled over the room like a quiet truth that could no longer be avoided, and Ethan felt it immediately. The shift from uncertainty to clarity, the movement from possibility to fact, and his focus sharpened. Because confirmation required evidence, required something tangible, something that could stand independent of interpretation. And before he could ask for it, Julian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements slow, deliberate, not dramatic but intentional, and the subtle motion drew every eye in the room, the cameras adjusting, the lenses narrowing, capturing the exact second where the abstract truth began to take form. And he pulled out a thin envelope, white, unmarked, the kind of object that carried no meaning until it was opened, and he held it for a moment, not raising it high, not presenting it to the crowd, but keeping it at a level that was visible to those closest. And he spoke, his voice steady. "This is what she waited for." And the simplicity of the statement carried weight, because it connected the present moment to the timeline Amara had described, the waiting, the need for confirmation, the decision to not speak too soon. And Ethan's gaze fixed on the envelope, not with suspicion but with understanding, because he knew what it represented even before it was opened, the kind of proof that could not be argued, the kind that did not depend on interpretation. And the room leaned in once more, the silence tightening, the anticipation shifting from curiosity to recognition. And Amara did not move to take the envelope. She did not step closer. She remained where she was, steady, composed, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it, because the truth no longer needed to be protected, it only needed to be revealed. And as the light from the open doors stretched further across the floor, illuminating the space between them, it caught the edge of the envelope in Julian's hand, reflecting softly, as if marking the exact point where waiting ended and clarity began. The envelope did not move at first, and that stillness seemed to stretch across the room, pulling every eye toward it, as if the truth itself had weight, as if it needed a moment to be acknowledged before it could be opened. And Ethan felt it in the way his focus narrowed, the edges of everything else fading until there was only that single object held between them. The quiet center of a moment that had already changed everything, yet still held the final piece of what it would become. And his breath slowed, not by intention but by instinct, because he understood what was coming even if he did not yet know the exact shape it would take. And Julian did not rush. He did not present the envelope with any dramatic gesture. He simply held it steady, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it forward. And Amara remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm. Because this was no longer about her holding the truth, it was about allowing it to be seen without distortion. And the room leaned in without moving, a collective stillness settling over the guests, the cameras, the staff, every person caught within the quiet gravity of what was about to be revealed. And then Julian extended his hand, not toward the crowd, not toward the cameras, but toward Ethan, the motion simple, deliberate, as if acknowledging that this part of the truth belonged directly to him. And Ethan did not reach for it immediately, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second as he measured the distance between assumption and reality, between what he had believed and what he was about to confirm. And that hesitation was not fear, it was awareness, the understanding that once he opened it, there would be no returning to the version of events he had constructed. And then he took it, his fingers closing around the edge of the envelope with a steadiness that masked the shift happening beneath the surface. And the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of anticipation alone, but out of recognition that this was the moment where the abstract would become concrete, where the story would no longer rely on interpretation but on something verifiable. And Ethan opened it carefully, not tearing, not rushing, his movements controlled even as the weight of the moment pressed against him. And inside was a single sheet, clean, precise, the kind of document that carried authority without needing explanation. And his eyes moved across it quickly at first, scanning, searching for the detail that would anchor everything Amara had said. And then they slowed, focusing, absorbing, and the shift in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, The tightening of his jaw, the slight widening of his gaze, the quiet recalibration that followed as the information settled into place, and he read it again, not because he doubted it, but because he needed to fully process what it meant, and the room remained silent, the cameras capturing every micro-movement, every change in posture, every breath that carried more weight than the last. And when Ethan finally looked up, his gaze did not move to the crowd. It went directly to Amara, as if the connection between the document in his hand and the truth she had been holding was now complete. And for a moment he said nothing, not because there were no words, but because the ones that existed no longer fit the certainty he had brought into the room. And when he did speak, his voice was quieter than it had ever been, stripped of authority, stripped of performance. "It is mine," he said, and the words did not echo, they did not rise. They settled, heavy and final, into the space between them, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but deeply felt, a shift that moved through the room like a quiet wave, altering everything without needing noise to confirm it. And the guests reacted in small ways, a hand covering a mouth, a breath released, a glance exchanged, but the center of the moment remained anchored between the three of them. Because this was no longer about speculation or accusation, it was about confirmation, and Amara did not react outwardly. She did not step forward or soften or retreat. She simply held his gaze, her silence intact, because this was not a moment she needed to claim. It was one that had arrived on its own, exactly as she had said it would. And Julian lowered his hand once the envelope had been taken, his role in that moment complete, his presence returning to stillness as the truth stood without his support. And Ethan looked down at the document once more, as if grounding himself in its certainty before facing what it meant beyond the words printed on the page. And when he spoke again, there was a shift in his tone, something more grounded, more aware. "Why did you not tell me when you knew?" he asked, and the question carried a different weight now, not accusatory, not defensive, but reflective, shaped by the understanding that there had been a sequence he had not allowed to unfold. And Amara answered with the same calm clarity that had guided her from the beginning. "Because knowing is not the same as confirming," she said, and the distinction landed with quiet precision, reinforcing the path she had chosen, the patience she had held, the reason she had waited for this exact moment instead of forcing an earlier one. And Ethan absorbed it, the logic aligning with the reality now in his hands, the understanding that if she had spoken too soon it would have been dismissed, questioned, turned into something uncertain instead of something undeniable. And he exhaled slowly, the breath carrying the weight of realization. And for the first time since the ceremony began, he looked not just at Amara, but at the space between them, the path that had been illuminated by the sequence of events, the distance that had been created not by truth, but by the way it had been approached. And the cameras captured that moment, the subtle shift from control to reflection, from certainty to understanding. And in that stillness, the light across the floor seemed brighter, not because it had changed, but because it now revealed something different, a connection that had been interrupted but not erased, a truth that had been delayed but not denied. And as Ethan stood there holding the document that confirmed everything, the reality of what he had ended and what still remained began to take shape in a way that could no longer be ignored, not by him, not by anyone watching, because the moment had moved beyond spectacle into something far more lasting, something that would not fade when the cameras turned away. The confirmation did not echo, yet it changed everything. And for a moment the room seemed to exist in two separate realities, one where the cameras still blinked and the guests still stood frozen in quiet disbelief, and another where only three people mattered, bound together by a truth that had finally stepped out of silence and into light. And Ethan could feel the shift in a way that no audience ever could, because it was no longer about what had happened in front of them. It was about what he had done in response to something he had never fully understood, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, heavier than the words he had spoken, heavier than the decision he had made. And his fingers tightened slightly around the document, as if grounding himself in the certainty it provided, because everything else around him now felt uncertain in a way he had never allowed before. And when he lifted his gaze again to meet Amara's, there was no distance left in it, no calculated detachment, only the quiet awareness of what he had ended without knowing the full truth, and the silence between them was no longer sharp. It was heavy, filled with everything that had not been said when it should have been, everything that had been assumed instead of understood. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the authority that had once defined it, only a quiet weight. "I should have stayed," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a depth that resonated far beyond their size, because they acknowledged not just a mistake, but a moment that could not be undone. And Amara heard it, not as an apology, not yet, but as a recognition, and she did not respond immediately, because this was not a moment that required quick answers. It required space, and she allowed that space to exist, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. Because her strength had never come from reaction, it had come from restraint, from knowing when to speak and when to let the truth stand on its own. And Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, not in defeat but in reflection, the kind that came when control no longer served a purpose, when understanding required something else entirely. And the room, sensing the shift from revelation to consequence, remained quiet in a different way now, less tense, more attentive, as if everyone present understood that what came next would not be dramatic, but meaningful. And Julian remained where he was, his presence steady, no longer central, but still part of the structure that had allowed this moment to unfold. And Ethan turned slightly toward him, his voice still measured. "You said you were there," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a need to understand the full shape of what had happened. And Julian nodded once, his response calm. "I was there when she chose not to let your reaction define the truth," he said, and the words aligned with everything that had been revealed, reinforcing the idea that his presence had not been about claim or competition, but about timing, about allowing something to exist without being forced into the wrong moment. And Ethan absorbed it, the contrast between their roles settling into place, not as a judgment, but as a realization. And he looked back at Amara, his expression softer now, more grounded, because the truth in his hands had changed the way he saw everything that had led to this point. And he spoke again, slower this time, as if each word carried weight he had not considered before. "You stood here, knowing this," he said, and the statement was not a question, it was an acknowledgement. And Amara nodded slightly, not with pride, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. "I stood here knowing it would come out when it could not be questioned," she said, and the clarity of her response reinforced everything she had done, every moment she had chosen to wait instead of speak, every decision she had made to protect the truth from being misunderstood. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath heavier now, because he could see the strength in that choice, the discipline it required, the patience he had not shown, and the realization did not just change how he saw her, it changed how he saw himself within the sequence of events. And for the first time since the ceremony began, he stepped forward, not to reclaim control, not to dominate the moment, but to close the distance created by his own actions. And the movement was subtle, but it carried meaning, because it signaled a shift from separation to acknowledgement, and the cameras caught it, the small step that said more than any statement could have. And the room remained still, watching, waiting, as the moment unfolded without the need for spectacle. And Ethan stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like a divide, but like something that could be crossed. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was something new in it, something grounded. "I made a decision based on a moment," he said, "and I treated it like it was the whole truth." And the words did not seek forgiveness. They did not ask for anything. They simply acknowledged the reality of what he had done. And Amara listened, her expression unchanged, because she did not need him to say it for herself. She had already lived the consequence of it. But hearing it mattered in a different way. It completed the sequence. It aligned his understanding with the truth she had carried. And the room felt it. The shift from revelation to responsibility, the quiet acknowledgement that followed. And Julian took a small step back then, not leaving the moment, but giving it space, because his role in bringing the truth forward had been fulfilled, and what remained now belonged to the two people standing at the center of it. And the light from the open doors stretched further across the floor, illuminating them both in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if marking the point where everything had changed. And in that light, with the truth no longer hidden and the past no longer uncertain, the future stood unspoken between them, waiting not for assumption, not for reaction, but for something far more difficult, something that required more than words, something that would have to be built with the understanding they had just reached, and neither of them moved to define it, because for the first time since the moment began, there was no need to rush. The space between them no longer felt like distance, but it was not yet connection either. It was something in between, something fragile and unspoken that held the weight of what had been broken and the uncertainty of what could still be built. And Ethan stood there in that space with a stillness that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him before this moment, because there was no calculation left in his posture, no strategy in the way he held himself, only the quiet awareness that control had never been the same as understanding, and that realization had changed him in a way that could not be reversed, and Amara could see it, not in a dramatic shift, but in the absence of what had once defined him, the sharp edges of certainty, the immediate conclusions, the distance he had maintained even when standing close. And now those things were gone, replaced by something slower, something more deliberate. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the silence itself carried meaning. It allowed everything that had been revealed to settle into place, to exist without being rushed into resolution. And around them the room remained suspended in that same quiet awareness, the guests no longer reacting but observing. The cameras still recording, but no longer chasing spectacle, because the moment had moved beyond anything that could be captured in a single frame. It had become something internal, something that would continue long after the lights dimmed. And the doors closed, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I cannot undo what I did," he said, and the statement did not ask for forgiveness. It did not attempt to soften the past. It simply acknowledged it as something fixed, something that could not be rewritten no matter how clearly it was now understood. And Amara listened, her expression unchanged, because she did not need him to undo it. She had already moved through the consequence of it, already carried the weight of his decision in silence until the truth had been able to stand on its own. And he continued, the words coming slower now, more deliberate. "But I can choose what I do next." And that statement shifted the focus forward, not as an escape from the past, but as a response to it. And it hung in the air between them, not demanding an answer, but offering a direction. And Amara held his gaze, her eyes steady, because she understood the significance of that shift, the difference between reacting to what had happened and taking responsibility for what would follow. And she spoke, her voice calm, grounded. "What you do next is not about proving anything," she said. "It is about understanding what you are part of now." And the words carried a quiet weight, because they moved the conversation beyond apology, beyond explanation, into something more lasting, something that required presence rather than performance. And Ethan absorbed it, the meaning settling into him with a clarity that felt both heavy and necessary. And he nodded slightly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition, because he could see it now. The truth was no longer something external that needed to be confirmed. It was something he was connected to, something that would shape every decision he made from this point forward. And his gaze dropped briefly to the document still in his hand, the paper that had confirmed what words alone could not. And then he looked back at her, his expression steady. "I want to understand all of it," he said, and there was no urgency in his voice, no demand for immediate answers, only a willingness to learn what he had not taken the time to see before. And Amara saw that as well, the shift from needing control to seeking understanding. And it did not change her stance. It did not erase what had happened, but it created space for something different to exist. And she answered with the same clarity she had held from the beginning. "Then you will need to listen without deciding what it means before it is finished," she said. And the instruction was simple, but it carried everything he had missed before, everything that had led to this moment. And Ethan nodded again, slower this time, because he understood that what she was asking was not easy. It required him to let go of the instincts that had shaped his entire life, to sit in uncertainty without forcing it into certainty too soon. And that was not something he had ever practiced, but it was something he was now willing to learn. And Julian watched the exchange from where he stood, his presence quieter now, no longer central to the moment, but still part of its foundation. And after a brief pause he spoke, his voice calm. She did not need someone to decide for her, he said. She needed someone who would stand still long enough for the truth to reach them. And the words did not challenge Ethan. They reinforced what Amara had already said, adding another layer to the understanding that was forming, and Ethan turned slightly toward him, not defensive, not resistant, but receptive, and he inclined his head just slightly, a small acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any verbal response could have, because it recognized the role Julian had played without turning it into conflict. And then his focus returned to Amara, because this moment, this truth, belonged primarily to them, and the room remained quiet. The earlier energy of shock and speculation replaced by something more grounded, more reflective, as if everyone present understood that what they were witnessing was not an ending or a reversal, but a transition, and the light from the open doors had softened now, stretching further across the floor, illuminating the space around them in a way that felt less like a spotlight and more like something steady, something that would remain, even after everything else faded. And Amara stood in that light without shifting, her presence as composed as it had been from the beginning, because her strength had never depended on what others did. It had come from what she chose to hold, and when she chose to release it. And now that the truth had been released, she did not rush to define what came next. She allowed it to exist in the same way she had allowed everything else, with patience, with clarity, with the understanding that some things could not be forced into immediate answers. And Ethan stood across from her, no longer trying to lead the moment, no longer trying to control its direction, but willing to remain within it, to let it unfold at the pace it required. And in that stillness, with the past acknowledged and the truth no longer hidden, the future remained open, not as something to be claimed or decided in a single moment, but as something that would have to be built step by step, with the same patience that had brought them to this point. And neither of them spoke again right away, because for the first time since the moment began, silence was no longer something to be filled, it was something to be respected. The silence held longer this time, not fragile but steady, as if it had found its place within the moment and no longer needed to be broken to move things forward. And the room seemed to adjust to it, the guests no longer shifting or whispering, the cameras no longer chasing reactions, but simply recording what had become something quieter and far more significant than spectacle. And at the center of it all, Amara remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, grounded, composed, her presence no longer defined by what had been revealed, but by what she chose to do with it now. And Ethan stood across from her with a stillness that mirrored her own in a way that would have been impossible only minutes before, because the urgency that had once driven him had been replaced by something more deliberate, something that required patience instead of control. And that shift was not just visible, it was felt, settling into the space between them like a new foundation that had not yet been tested but could no longer be ignored. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that change, steady but quieter. "I am not asking for a second chance in this moment," he said, and the words were measured, chosen with care. "I am asking for the chance to show that I can understand what I did not before." And the distinction mattered, because it moved away from immediate resolution and towards something that would require time, consistency, presence, and Amara heard it, not as a promise, not as something she needed to accept or reject, but as an intention that would only hold meaning if it was followed by action. And she did not respond right away, because her silence was no longer a space of uncertainty. It was a space of consideration, of choosing carefully what came next. And the room remained still, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet awareness that this moment was no longer about what had happened, but about what would follow. And Julian stood a few steps back now, his presence unchanged, but his role clearly shifted. No longer part of the immediate exchange, but still connected to the truth that had brought them here. And after a brief pause, he spoke, not to interrupt, but to add something that belonged to the moment, his voice calm. "Understanding is not something you declare," he said. "It is something you demonstrate over time." And the words settled gently but firmly, reinforcing the direction the moment had taken, and Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in that statement without resistance. Because he no longer needed to assert himself, he needed to listen. And then his attention returned to Amara, because her response, whether spoken or not, would define the next step. And she finally spoke, her voice calm, grounded, carrying the same clarity that had guided her through every part of this moment. "Time is not something you can control," she said, "but it is something you can respect." And the words carried a quiet weight, because they outlined the only path forward without promising where it would lead, and Ethan absorbed it fully, the meaning settling into him with a clarity that did not require further explanation, and he nodded once, slowly, not as agreement alone, but as acceptance of the process that would be required, and the space between them shifted again, not closing but changing, becoming something less rigid, less defined by what had been broken and more open to what could be rebuilt, and the light from the open doors had softened further now, spreading across the ballroom in a way that felt less like a spotlight and more like a constant presence, illuminating everything evenly, without focus on any one moment. And in that light, Amara took a small step back, not retreating but creating space, the same way she had done throughout the entire sequence, allowing the moment to breathe instead of forcing it into resolution, and her gaze moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the presence of the people who had witnessed everything without letting it define her. And then it returned to Ethan, steady, unchanged, and she spoke again, her tone even. "What happens next will not be decided here," she said, and the statement carried a quiet finality, because it removed the expectation that this moment, no matter how significant, could resolve everything that had been set in motion, and Ethan understood that immediately, the implications settling into him without resistance. Because he no longer sought immediate answers, he understood now that what mattered would take time, and he responded with a simple nod, his voice steady. "Then I will be where I need to be when that time comes," he said, and there was no performance in it, no attempt to impress or persuade, only a statement of intention that would have to be proven beyond this room, beyond these cameras, beyond this moment. And Amara did not respond to that directly, because she did not need to. The truth had already shifted everything that needed to be shifted here, and what remained could not be resolved with words alone. And Julian took another step back, creating more space between himself and the center of the moment, his presence now fully supportive rather than active, and the room began to shift slowly, not with noise or sudden movement, but with a gradual release of the stillness that had held it in place, as if everyone present understood that the moment had reached its natural end, not because everything was resolved, but because everything that needed to be revealed had been revealed, and the cameras continued to record, but the energy behind them had changed, no longer chasing a dramatic conclusion, but capturing the quiet aftermath of something far more meaningful. And as the light continued to fill the space, soft and steady, Amara turned slightly, not away from Ethan, but toward the path that led beyond the ballroom, and for a brief second she paused, her hand resting lightly against the fabric of her dress, her posture unchanged, her presence as composed as ever, and then she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet strength that had defined every step she had taken from the beginning, leaving the center of the room not as someone who had been left behind, but as someone who had chosen exactly when and how to step forward. And Ethan watched her go, not with the urgency to follow, not with the need to call her back, but with the understanding that this was not a moment to chase. It was a moment to honor, to respect the space she had created. And as she reached the edge of the light and moved beyond it, the reality of what had happened remained, steady, undeniable, no longer something to react to, but something to live with, something to build from, something that would define what came next in ways that could not yet be seen, but were already in motion. The doors did not close behind her. They remained open, and that detail lingered longer than anything else, because it meant the moment had not been sealed, it had not been contained, it had been allowed to extend beyond the room, beyond the cameras, beyond the version of the story that would be told in headlines and replayed in fragments. And as Amara stepped past the edge of the light and into the quieter space beyond the ballroom, her pace remained steady, unhurried, as if every step had already been decided long before she took it, and the sound of her heels softened against the polished floor as distance grew between her and the center of everything that had unfolded, not as an escape, not as a retreat, but as a continuation of the same choice she had made from the beginning, to move when the moment was right and not before. And inside the ballroom, Ethan did not follow. not because he did not want to, but because he understood now that movement alone would not mean anything without understanding behind it. And so he stood where he was, the document still in his hand, the weight of it no longer just physical but symbolic, a confirmation not only of what was true but of what had been misunderstood. And the room slowly began to shift around him, guests lowering their phones, conversations starting again in quiet tones, the atmosphere easing from stillness and emotion, but he remained anchored in place, his focus not on the people around him but on the path that had just unfolded in front of him. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion but in clarity, allowing everything to settle without interruption, the sequence, the timing, the difference between what he had assumed and what had actually been. And when he opened them again, the space felt different, not because anything had changed externally but because his perspective had. And Julian stood a few feet away, his presence calm, no longer central but still connected to the moment in a way that did not require attention. And after a brief pause, Ethan spoke, his voice steady. "You stayed," he said, and the words were not a question, they were an acknowledgement. And Julian nodded once, his response simple. "She needed someone who would not turn a moment into a conclusion," he said, and the statement did not challenge Ethan. It completed the understanding that had been building piece by piece, and Ethan absorbed it fully. The contrast between their actions no longer something to defend against, but something to learn from. And he nodded slightly in return, not as agreement alone, but as recognition. And then his gaze shifted toward the open doors, toward the space where Amara had gone. And for a moment he remained still, measuring the distance not in steps, but in meaning. And then he moved, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the same deliberate pace that had replaced his earlier urgency. And as he reached the threshold, the light shifted again, softer now, less defined. And beyond it the hallway stretched quiet and open, a contrast to the intensity of the room he had just left. And he stepped into that space with a steadiness that felt new, not controlled but intentional. And further ahead he saw her, her silhouette framed by the natural light coming through tall windows at the end of the corridor, her posture unchanged, her presence as composed as ever. And for a brief moment he did not call out to her. He did not close the distance immediately. He allowed the space to exist, to hold the transition between what had been and what could be. And then he spoke, his voice carrying through the quiet without force. "Amara." And she stopped, not abruptly, not with surprise, but with the same measured awareness that had guided every step she had taken. And she turned slowly, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. And in that moment there was no crowd, no cameras, no external pressure shaping what came next. Only the two of them and the truth that now existed between them. And Ethan stepped closer, reducing the distance but not erasing it entirely, because he understood now. That proximity did not create connection. It only offered the possibility of it. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, grounded. "I am not here to ask you to go back," he said. "I am here because I do not want to move forward without understanding where you stand." And the words carried a different weight than anything he had said before, not seeking to control the outcome, but to acknowledge her position within it. And Amara listened, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, because she had not left to be followed. She had left to create space. And she answered with the same clarity she had held from the beginning. "Where I stand has not changed," she said. "But what I accept will depend on what you do with what you now know." And the statement was neither invitation nor rejection. It was a boundary, a clear line that defined what mattered moving forward. And Ethan nodded slowly, because he understood that fully now. That knowledge alone did not shift anything unless it was followed by action, by consistency, by presence. And he did not respond with promises. He did not offer assurances that could not yet be proven. He simply said, "Then I will begin there." And the simplicity of it carried more meaning than anything else could have, because it acknowledged the starting point without trying to define the end. And Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring not just his words but the intention behind them. And then she nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. And she turned again, continuing forward down the hallway with the same steady pace. And this time when Ethan followed, he did so at a distance that respected the space she had set, not trying to close it too quickly, not trying to claim what had not yet been given. but moving within the understanding that had been built, step by step, moment by moment. And behind them the ballroom remained, the echoes of what had happened still lingering within it. But ahead of them the space was quiet, open, undefined, and as they moved forward the light shifted again, no longer sharp or dividing, but even and constant, illuminating a path that did not promise certainty but allowed for it to be built, not through assumption, not through reaction, but through the patience they had both come to understand. And in that quiet continuation, without spectacle, without urgency, the story did not end. It transformed, becoming something that would not be decided in a single moment but shaped over time, grounded in truth, guided by understanding, and carried forward by the choices they would make from this point on.